Good afternoon. Welcome to the MDIC Annual Public Forum. My name is Sandy Siami. I am the Senior Vice President at MDIC, and I head the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, Coordinating Center. This afternoon, I will give a brief presentation followed by a panel session with representatives from our governing committee as well as FDA CDRH. NEST is comprised of diverse stakeholders. This includes not only industry and regulators, but payers, academic medical centers, health systems, researchers, registry networks, clinicians, and most importantly, patients. But it's also important to acknowledge we're not just a broad group of stakeholders, but we are a community. Given that NEST is a community, it was really imperative that our mission and vision reflect our North Star. Our mission is that the NEST community, is passionately committed to transforming the way medical device technologies are tested, approved, and monitored. Our vision is that we envision a world in which people are empowered to make informed medical choices that enable patients to live their lives to the fullest extent possible. As such, NEST is comprised of three major core initiatives. The first is our research program, where NEST is a coordinating center that delivers high-quality evidence in the evaluation of medical devices and health technologies throughout the total product lifecycle for regulatory, reimbursement, and clinical decision-making. You can hear about NEST a little more in the CDRH Town Hall broadcast that's later this afternoon. Our next initiative is our active surveillance system, which through dedicated appropriations from the FDA, we are establishing a first of its kind medical device active surveillance system and a roadmap to conduct that timely software-based real-world data analysis for medical devices for signal detection, refinement, and even emerging signal identification. You can hear more about active surveillance in our on-demand session during the MDIC Annual Public Forum. And finally, is that NEST was recognized by the FDA as a collaborative community, working to bring together our diverse stakeholders to address common medical device ecosystem needs and initiatives. This includes our Unique Device Identifier, or UDI, adoption study. And also on the collaborative community, you can hear more about that within other MDIC collaborative communities during the MDIC APF session tomorrow afternoon. In addition to the core initiatives, NEST also participates in other MDIC programs involving real-world evidence. This includes SHIELD on interoperability of lab data for in vitro diagnostics, our health economics and patient value real-world evidence. This is to provide the evidentiary requirements for coverage and reimbursement, as well as amplifying the patient voice in selection of the treatment options. We have external evidence methods on innovative analytical methods for clinical trial decision-making. And finally, our Clinical Science and Medical Officer Group, or CSMO group, in developing those real-world evidence principles. It is through these core initiatives and programs that we are providing quality evidence by design. NEST is leveraging our unique position to combine real-world evidence with unparalleled expertise to accelerate patient access to safe and effective medical technology. This is really all for the end user, which is the patient. The NEST system curates various data sources to meet specific objectives for data reliability and relevance across device types, disease areas, and the total product lifecycle. The system catalyzes transparent and traceable real-world data provenance in order to lead to actionable evidence. And finally, the system creates a central and scalable architecture for interoperability. NEST continues to build our infrastructure and quality management system while also completing our 4 major MDUFA 4 commitments. Our first commitment was to implement pilots, or test cases as we call them, for at least 2 product codes within the 510(k) and PMA pathways, and that those pilots should take place over 3 years. We have 21 test cases that we have executed. Some are being completed, some have been completed, others are being completed. 10 already have final results, and most of which have been previously presented, most recently at the NEST Real World Evidence Forum about 2 weeks ago. I hope you caught that. We have made tremendous progress and do expect that 18 of these 21 test cases will be completed by the end of 3rd quarter of this year. We have also been meeting with the various CDRH review groups within the different Office of Health Technology, or OHTs. And these test cases are informally discussed, and we talk about the research, the findings, the insights, as well as getting feedback from the reviewers for additional items for consideration. The FDA has also encouraged formal and interactive pre-submission, or Q-sub meetings, where submitting organizations or sponsors can request specific FDA feedback. Our next commitment was that a 3rd party will conduct this independent assessment at the end of the pilots and evaluate the strengths, the limitations, the appropriate use of real-world evidence for that pre-market decision-making. We've engaged RAND Corporation to perform these independent assessments. And given the timing of the completion of these test cases, RAND has already begun the process for the first 8 to 10 test cases. And a final report will be available after all the test cases are completed and the assessments are performed. Our next commitment was that no later than October 1st of 2020, we would hold a public meeting to review and evaluate the progress and outcomes. We did hold a NEST forum on the 22nd of September back in 2020. Those recordings are also available. But in the spirit of the commitment, we dedicated to hold continuing mini forums as our test cases were completed, like the Real World Evidence Forum we had 2 weeks ago. And finally, as a coordinating center, we should seek ways to make NEST financially self-sustaining. As many of you know, NEST opened our doors to sponsored research and external funding in June of 2020. We continue to work through our business plan for self-sustainability and have several contracts already. This is a visual presentation of our 21 test cases. One of the main objectives of these pilots was to explore the feasibility of working with the various types of real-world data within our network collaborators, and to also help identify areas where NEST can develop efficiencies using real-world data. We've managed to execute pilots in a variety of therapeutic areas across a variety of product codes within the 510(k) and PMA pathways. You'll see we've worked with what I call traditional medical devices, but also diagnostics, digital health solutions, and other health technologies across various stages of the total product lifecycle. The submitting organizations include large, mid-size, and smaller medical device companies, as well as the FDA and patient advocacy organizations. And we continue to learn from these experiences. Integral to executing these test cases, as well as being required for the system, are our frameworks. Both our research methods and data quality frameworks were initially released last year. They are currently being transformed into real-world evidence standards for sponsors, FDA reviewers, and other stakeholders. The research methods framework is defining the expectations on the types of study design, statistical methods, and data sources for different types of studies. It will provide examples as well as incorporate lessons learned. The data quality framework has pivoted to provide not only the data quality maturity model grids for electronic health records and claims providers, but to really set the standard for data quality depending on the purpose of the study to really get to that fit for purpose. As we continue to evolve, we're building our foundation to deliver on the visions of real-world evidence in the medical device ecosystem. We think about the future on what we can curate, what we can catalyze, and what we can create. As we complete our current obligations and continue to disseminate results, we want to incorporate in earnest those lessons learned. We must expand the diversity and the depth of our research network and data partners, as well as our in-house quality systems, infrastructures, and capabilities. We're looking to bridge that gap between registries and electronic health records and claims to case report forms or other databases, and potentially looking to explore that certification or evaluation of our networks for the various types of studies. We are providing those standards for real-world evidence principles, research methods, data quality that fit for purpose, and advancing real-world evidence through more diverse data and device types, such as IVDs, imaging, digital health, combination devices, really taking the idea of the total product lifecycle to heart by expanding the use of real-world data the moment it hits the clinical stage with first-in-man early feasibility, as well as randomized controlled trials, pragmatic trials, and then expanding into coverage, health technology assessments, post-coverage studies for that high-value breakthrough technologies, and other health economic uses. And finally, as we continue to create value, we are seeking to expand so that we're able to serve as the independent statistical arm for analysis of distributed data, to broaden our active surveillance to support a wide range of evidentiary needs, and to continue to address the challenges of the ecosystem, including data linkage, UDI adoption, data interoperability, and those common data models. NEST has a team and its stakeholders, the community. They have accomplished a tremendous amount, and we're starting to move the needle to see broader use of real-world evidence in medical devices. I'd like to now move into our panel discussion. I would now like to introduce our rock star panelists for this session. We have Adrian Hernandez, who is Executive Director of Duke Clinical Research Institute and Vice Dean at Duke University School of Medicine. He is a true visionary. He continues to raise DCRI's profile both nationally and internationally, and he is currently the NEST Governing Committee Chair. So I'm very pleased to have Adrian on board. We also have David Maggs, who is Vice President of Medical Affairs at Becton Dickinson Technologies and Innovation, so BDTI. He is an innovator providing medical, scientific, and technical customer-focused leadership. He is currently one of our NEST Governing Committee industry members, and I'm thrilled to have him on this panel. Last but not least, we have Felipe Aguel, who is the Deputy Director of the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. With his biomedical engineering background, he is a driving force at OSEA, including real-world evidence, and he is one of our CDRH partners that we are collaborating with regularly for NEST. So welcome, panelists. And our topics this afternoon will focus on the evolving future and setting the standards in real-world evidence, particularly using real-world evidence earlier in the total product lifecycle, setting standards for research methods and data quality frameworks, common data models, unique device identifiers. These topics are not for the faint of heart. So with that, let's jump right in. Let's first talk about a little bit the use of real-world evidence earlier in the total product lifecycle, right? We've talked about Jeff Shuren's vision of using real-world evidence in the total product lifecycle. So let's talk about using it a little bit earlier. What are the panel's thoughts about the feasibility of incorporating real-world data earlier on in that life cycle, like in first in man or early feasibility, randomized controlled trials?
Well, Sandy, if you don't mind, I'll jump in first and welcome my fellow panelist colleagues, Felipe and Adrian. I just want to maybe spend a moment congratulating you, Sandy, on your leadership at NEST, all the great things that you've done, accomplished this last few years, the research projects, the test cases, the surveillance capability of building, the collaborative community. It's a long list, but I just want to give you some accolade for all your great work.
Well, so first of all, thank you, David, but you're not going to keep me from asking you the tough questions.
That's not the answer to my question. So anyway, back to the question. I think we all know and experience that there's a nice groundswell of interest in real-world data, real-world evidence. We're feeling it in many different ways, seeing it a lot where I operate from. Yes, it is going to be used more in the development phase. The conventional thinking is that real-world data is examined more in the commercial phase, product sustenance, surveillance, and so on. But we're seeing now that real-world data is now being considered much more in the development phase. Just in the last 2 years, we have our annual clinical planning cycle. You can already see an uptick in interest in embedding real-world data in the development programs on the way to, approvals, clearances, and so on. You have this great publication just very recently from the FDA, itemizing and an inventory of very impressive exemplars of real-world data, some of it registry-based, a lot not registry-based. So just a very impressive array of data that the FDA is now looking at. I've got the great article from the MDIC around external evidence methods, which is now an analytical statistical framework, which is a good sort of roadmap for us. And then you have your test cases where, a half or 2/3 are actually development phase. So I think the evidence about the real-world evidence is that everything is moving a little earlier. And my last comment is I often see very early stage ideation projects which have yet to become a product. And I'm already seeing us using real-world data to better understand the actual clinical unmet need. The staple is to use things like the literature, proxies from other products, market research, and so on. But in the last 12 months, we have actually leveraged real-world data to get a more contemporary and fresh look at whatever the problem is that you're solving for. And I see that's all at the very front end of product development. So I'm all for this pendulum shift to early use of real world data.
So I'll also add my congratulations to you, Sandy, and the whole NEST team in terms of what you all have done this past year especially. And I come at this from 2 points of view, as a clinician and as a researcher within healthcare systems. And so in that setting, if we think about the problem we're aiming to solve, often it's only about 2 to 4% of people who are eligible or participate in clinical trials, yet we're having to take care of the other so-called 96 or 98%. And so if you think about the spectrum in terms of where real data can make an impact for evidence generation, it can be earlier on and development and also the life cycle management of new technologies. This past year has certainly shown us that case when people needed answers quickly regarding diagnostic testing, for instance. And there are a number of health problems that we have right now that as COVID-19 thankfully gets better, we still have a lot of health problems that we're trying to address. And so the sooner we can address those answers and iterate in terms of new medical innovations here, the better we'll be here. And underlying that is a system of real-world data that can be used as a foundation for this.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. It's certainly possible and desirable to use real-world evidence throughout the product lifecycle, including at the very beginning, very early on. That said, by definition, real-world evidence involving the use of a device involves data collected on the device after it's been marketed and used in the course of standard clinical practice. So for devices that are not yet marketed, it may be possible to leverage real-world evidence collected with a different device, for example, as a control group in a clinical trial, or even to confirm answers to pre-market questions for a yet-to-be marketed device, if the data related to those different devices are considered relevant from a regulatory perspective. Now, that said, we have to keep in mind that there are still challenges to overcome, and NEST is working on those challenges regarding data quality and methods, even for cases where devices have been on the market for a long time, and there's a lot of experience with those devices, and a lot of patients are using them, so there's a large data cohort to pull from. So even though it's a worthwhile endeavor and fully support and endorse trying to use real-world evidence early on, even for regulatory decisions, it seems that the quote-unquote lower hanging fruit of using real-world evidence for indications expansions, for informing labeling changes, et cetera, there's still some work to be done there. And I think we all recognize that we need to tackle those challenges. And we say, I said lower hanging fruit, but I don't think it's so low hanging. I think there are still some challenges to address there. And in order to really move the point at which real-world evidence is used earlier on, we have to start with tackling those challenges. That said, as was alluded to earlier, there have been examples where the agency has used real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making very early on in the total product lifecycle. So it is doable. It has been done. It is doable, and we should continue to work on both aspects: the expansion of indications for devices that are pretty mature, as well as trying to push the envelope and finding places earlier in the product lifecycle where high quality evidence can be developed that is relevant for regulatory questions.
I think all the perspectives are really great here, and certainly to Felipe's point, we do have a lot of work to do with what I will call kind of the easy stuff, or low-hanging fruit, as Felipe called it. But I do like to be aspirational too, of looking further in the future of how we can really penetrate the total product life cycle. I mean, when we talk about TPLC, we're not just talking about label expansions or post-market surveillance. And so how can we really accomplish that? And is there a role? I mean, does the panel think there is a role with NEST eventually accomplishing this?
So towards that aim, and this is what I mean in terms of, you can see real-world data being a foundation for real-world evidence. And in terms of how it's used, it may vary in terms of where the product is in its life cycle. And so what other information may be needed. There may be additional information that's not generated routinely as part of real-world data in the early product life cycle, but there's also information that's part of routine healthcare. Or it can, as things are becoming more and more digitized in terms of understanding people's health trajectories, that's being integrated. So if you just look at this past year, like how things have converted in terms of getting data ingested in all sorts of ways, that becomes a foundation. The second thing, just to for consideration here, is that the sooner we can get to the so-called research world being viewed as a perfect world, and the healthcare world being the real world closer together, and taking advantage of that, the better we'll be. Otherwise, having these parallel worlds are not necessarily the most efficient to addressing health problems. The last thing I just think has to be considered is that there has to be, and the FDA has commented on this in a variety of forms, fit for purpose. Context matters. And so when you start thinking about the major public health problems and what's needed when, like, context matters. And then also what may be existing data that you can provide for comparative benchmarks. And so again, trying to have something that understands where a new product may fit in compared to what may be standard of care, or something that may be completely new. It depends.
Yeah, just to build a little bit on that, Adrian, at least in my role, the breadth of early stage products in their form, design, and the clinical setting that they're being projected to be used is extremely variable. And so real world evidence may not fit easily in the development plan early in the product life cycle for the reasons that Adrian is highlighting. And in other cases, again, pouring through some of the examples from this from the recent FDA publication, you can see very quickly how real-world data does fit well with a particular product in during that early development phase. So it isn't one size fits all by any stretch. It's very much customized to the development setting.
Sure.
David, I think that's a key point, that it really depends on the situation as to whether or not we can use real world data very early on. And I think that is highlighted in the examples that were chosen for that publication. One thing I will mention is that we do see and are very excited about the prospect of embedding clinical trials within the framework of real world data, such that maybe not all of the follow-up in a study, but we can envision a future where part of the follow-up is conducted in traditional ways, but longer term follow-up that is needed is then conducted according to standard clinical practice, by definition, real world data. And the endpoints and the trials can be designed in such a way that lowers the burden on trials. So it's not an all or none. It's not a traditional clinical study or collection of real world data to make a regulatory decision. That merging of the two is something that we have been thinking about. The referenced external evidence methods framework is an important part of that work, and importantly, embedding clinical trials into the infrastructure developed for real-world data collection is something that, like I said, we're excited about and are preparing for, and hope that industry and NEST will help us figure out how to make that a reality.
Right, and Felipe, don't be surprised if I keep talking about getting real-world data and real-world evidence earlier in the total product lifecycle. That's my aspiration. I will get it done. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but you'll see it definitely. Moving on and talking about something that Felipe did bring up as key to being able to do these types of studies throughout the total product lifecycle is, developing standards for research methods and data quality. And so, David and Adrian, how do you see NEST's role in developing standards for research methods and data quality?
Well, I'll jump in. If you look at what NEST has at its fingertips now, and you wind the clock forward, say, 5 years, and assuming Sandy continues to flourish, leading the organization as she is now, you can see that NEST could become a rich data engine for real-world evidence in many different real-world settings, development phase, commercial phase, surveillance, etc. And embedded within that, the data quality framework that you are also building alongside that meets regulatory muster. You can only imagine that over the next few years, you will be authoring an awful lot of very important guidances for real-world evidence generation in different forms, different settings, the data quality needs in those different settings. So I have to imagine that that's what will happen. It may be partnered with NDIC, and who knows, maybe even our regulatory colleagues. But I have to assume that the momentum you have now will translate into an awful lot of very important guidance that's going to appear over the next 5 years.
And there has been progress on this in terms of setting standards and getting to common data models here. And I think everyone in the ecosystem is tired of essentially having to create the Rosetta Stone for each project. Yep. I think those times were long ago, and so I think we're ready to move on. And so whether it is having a common data model or having different translators for each, it's important to do this, to make sure that we have trustworthy evidence here, and also to be more efficient for the evidence generation for all the different stakeholders, whether it's the manufacturer that has a medical innovation that they're trying to generate evidence on, the healthcare systems that wants to use that information for decision making, or regulatory agencies. We need to get on and having those standards, and NEST as this kind of neutral hub can really help facilitate that and accelerate it.
Yeah, I'm also excited by your test cases. Is it 20 or 21? Some of them, or no, most of them reading out in the latter part of this year. That's your sort of first sort of rush of data. And I think that's going to be a great learning moment, seeing what worked well, what could improve. And that's the start of the data engine. So I think you've got a very exciting period ahead of you when these test cases start to read out.
And we're starting to see that, right, David? We are starting to see them complete and get those results and the interim learnings, and certainly can't wait until we hear, the RAND assessment after all of the test cases are completed too. But this is what the segues actually really nicely into common data models, because one of the learnings that we have gleaned from the test cases that have been completed, and even interim results and findings from ongoing test cases, is there is a burden, right, of that manual entry, that duplicative validation, because we're not all working on a common data model. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about CDMs as it relates to standards, but what are really some barriers that we have to adopting a common data model for better, more standardized data extraction? Thoughts?
I'll start with kind of two examples here. So one, if you just look at medical technology, the diversity of medical technology that's out there and being developed, there are a number of different data needs, and so that's just one consideration. So like there has to be, you know, some understanding, like, you know, what's going to be the most focus areas for that. The second thing is that if you think about the rural data that's being generated through healthcare delivery, there are a number of dialects. And what I mean by that is that practice patterns are different in different places. How people record information about patient care is different, partly because of context, partly because of, I'll just say, learning practices that people have. Also partly because of how things have been structured with electronic health records and their implementation. But each month or each year, it seems like things are getting better in terms of that curation part and the technologies to curate it. And I think one of the things that's going to be of great interest is when we talk about common data model, it's like this idea that there's just one common data model. There's not. There's actually multiple ones. But what can be refined that will be more specific and more valuable for medical technology? I think that's going to be one of the things that we'll see, you know, coming out in the future. Also see NEST having a great contribution for that.
Yeah, and I can't claim expertise in common data models, but I understand why they need to exist when you're dealing with very disparate data and trying to pull them together into some sort of homogeneous form. Clearly, you've seen great examples of why common data models count. The most recent one is with COVID, you know, trying to harmonize very disparate data around coronavirus. So for NEST going forward, it seems almost inconceivable that you wouldn't find some way to institute some common data model form that allows you to toggle between your large data sets so that you can start asking very big questions around very big data. But the barriers, I guess, are technical. And I think there must be some element of collaboration, you know, with these external parties. I had some experience of engaging with different big hospital systems, and they have big data at their fingertips. But how they leverage their own data and use their own data is quite variable. And their appetite to somehow have their data configured in a way to be useful for someone else is part of the puzzle. But I see, you know, there's clearly a technical thing here that's way above my pay grade, but there needs to be some effort at collaboration to make this all work.
And certainly with our sorry, Adrian, but certainly with our network collaborators too, we have been engaging to find out, you know, if they use common data models, what that might be, and we see, you know, a great variation. And NEST isn't looking to create yet another common data model, but can we find a common data model that we might need to tweak, for example, to accommodate doing that unique medical device research, right? That's unique to medical devices. And that's where we're trying to find that medium. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's totally okay. I think that's a great point, Sandy, and agreed that NEST is in a great position with the 16 network collaborators and counting to bring them together and find that commonality, right? This is all about heterogeneity across systems and uses and medical specialties, et cetera. NEST position as a potential aggregator of data and curator of data lets you see the commonality across the network collaborators to allow you to see what could be tweaked and what common ground can be found, and is it a combination of that collaboration that was just alluded to with a technological solution that NEST could put on top of that to aggregate data and really make it a on the later end of the total product life cycle to have that active surveillance system. You need more than one network collaborator at a time. You need to put the data together in order to make it effective.
That's right. And how can we potentially do some transformation of one CDM to another, right? That's another topic of conversation too. But I don't want to get too much into active surveillance because there's an on-demand session for APF, and I don't want to lose their thunder, and I want the audience to watch it. So I don't want to get too far in. But the last heavy topic, and you know, we're kind of coming to the end of time, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. And my team will tell you I love to talk, and I love to talk about NEST, so I could go on all day. Our next topic I do want to touch on just ever so slightly, even though it's quite a heavy topic, is unique device identifiers, right? And so recognizing that NEST is the convener of the NEST collaborative community, and we have taken on the UDI adoption project as one of our first projects in UDI. How can NEST, how can our community work with the collaborative community to really be most impactful in both in the short term and the long term?
So, you know, there's been a lot of interest about incorporating UDI and healthcare for a while, for a lot of great reasons. Yeah. And so I think, you know, if you think about example of people's lives every day, where they go to the grocery store and have a barcode that scans something that they buy there, to, you know, getting a notice about a part in their car that's has a warranty recall, that's something that we take as kind of normal life these days. And so the same types of value can be generated in healthcare delivery. This past year has taught us that, like, it's actually really important to understand our supply chain. Like, we need to know what, where. And so if you think about the business case for healthcare delivery, it's understanding the supply chain. And then for real world data and real world evidence, again, taking that information and being able to know how medical products are being used and the effectiveness and safety is of high value for those of us in healthcare delivery, healthcare systems, as well as the other stakeholders. So the better that we can do for incorporating UDI into daily lives, like in these other examples, I think the better we'll be.
Agree 100% with that point. I think UDI, although not a silver bullet for understanding all the use and exposure to a given device, certainly gets us you know, much more than halfway there, right? It gets us a lot of the way there. That said, you know, I wonder if shorter term we need to be thinking about alternative solutions, things like technological solutions to do crosswalks within multiple data systems that are available to be able to ascertain device exposure and device usage in a way that we can begin using now, rather than just banking on UDI and waiting for widespread adoption and quality and so on and so forth. I think we need to be working on both of those in parallel. And one of the potential advantages to that is that if you have two different ways to do it, one can be used as a validator for the other, a way to triangulate the information that you're getting from UDI, especially early on. So I think we need to work on both processes in parallel, drive adoption by demonstrating value for UDI, and at the same time working on technological solutions to get the information we need as best we can without having all of that UDI information we'd like to have.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with both Adrian and Felipe in the general comments. For me, it just seems that a little bit of a shame that such a lift was done by industry sponsors to uniquely identify products, and yet it's not being pulled through to usable data on the back end that can be leveraged to ask important questions around safety, effectiveness, and so on. I sort of have a slightly tangential thought, which is I'm interested, or we're interested in better understanding how aggregated products serve to solve a clinical problem. So, for example, big healthcare systems may have a problem with infections in the hospital or sepsis, or they may have a patient who's unfortunately losing their limb through diabetes. These clinical problems are highly complex and have a number of steps along the way with products, pharmaceuticals, etc. And I wonder in a future state whether you can actually start looking at aggregated products and drugs in terms of how they're handling clinical problems. And UDI system may allow you to have that luxury of looking at sort of aggregated, integrated solutions rather than just an individual product. So maybe not super helpful for the short term, but something for future state.
Right, and I don't want to steal our collaborative community discussion that's tomorrow afternoon. They'll be talking about UDI even more, but I definitely wanted to get panel input on this. And as I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I could talk forever about NEST and everything related to NEST and all of our ideas and things that we have to do. But our time has come to an end. And I want to thank our panelists for an engaging discussion, and that you're all still standing or maybe sitting. So you were definitely not faint of heart. So I always a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, Sandy.
I want to thank all of our panelists and you, our attendees, our stakeholders, who are our community. As I like to say, #Nest Rocks, and I hope you can stay for the rest of the sessions this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. Thank you so much.